now enter a new age. We seem to do that quite often on this show, and this age is probably the shortest lived of them all. Welcome one and all to the post-PC age. The age when everyone and their cow would peddle underdeveloped and underpowered hardware as being the future, when they couldn't even handle the present. And yet these, within just a few months, would replace all those despisable beige boxes that just sit there looking ugly and doing all of the work. It began with Apple announcing the iPad, a tablet device that finally brought the concept to the attention of the masses. It was not a new concept. We've covered this on the show. It's ancient. It quickly became the new thing, and would stay the new thing for a while. The intense marketing combined with a media that was so unsavvy that it would not even understand what it was talking about, even in the technology sector that it was supposed to be knowledgeable of, made a lot of people in a lot of schools buy them, only to abandon them, especially the schools, when they realized a cheaper laptop was still better for productivity and education. They were, however, very useful to keep cats busy. And this age of overhype continued with the Kinect, the final version of Microsoft's Project Natal. It was supposed to replace traditional controls beyond gamepad, beyond motion control. It was now the age of gesture control. Only it didn't really work that well, but it functioned well enough to begin a new trend, that of the dance game. The world at large was still reeling from the economy going belly up. Countries were burning, and not figuratively. Detroit was starting to look like RoboCop predicted it would look. That year, Haiti was struck by a massive earthquake that killed over 100,000 people and left over 1 million homeless. The entire nation was in shambles. And just a month later, an even bigger earthquake hit Chile that killed considerably fewer people and caused tsunamis that were spread all throughout the world. In more geologically stable places, people were finishing up the tallest building ever erected by mankind, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And speaking of biggest things ever, the biggest spill in the oil industry's history occurred after the BP Deepwater Horizon explosion, a spill that blanketed the Gulf of Mexico in oil, causing severe damage to the environment. Things were getting so bad that even the nuclear option was on the table, though I guess that was more because somebody really wanted to see a nuke blow up. But what people interested in video games were more excited about than seeing the ocean being blown up by a nuke was a sequel to the game that had cornered the RTS genre. Starcraft II had been announced a couple of years prior with a tagline, "Hell, it's about time." And 12 years after the original, it really was. Wings of Liberty brought an exciting single-player campaign designed by some of the people that brought you Red Alert 2. And alongside that campaign, there was a multiplayer mode that struggled a bit to replace its predecessor, but eventually it did, until they turned it back around again. It was also only 1/3 of a game. It would take quite a few years for the whole thing to get done. The RTS genre was going through a few growing pains, or dead spasms depending on your perspective. While we were still getting some innovation in titles like Ruse, a multiplayer strategy game that focused on deception more than anything else, we were also getting things like Command & Conquer 4 Tiberian Twilight, which was trying to insert MOBA elements into the game, the MOBA, the Multiplayer Online Battle Arena, now being one of the biggest things in gaming, thanks in no small part to League of Legends. Then this brought about disastrous consequences, this being effectively the last Command & Conquer game. Though it's not like Electronic Arts wasn't trying to bastardize everything it had on hand back then. What with it turning Ultima into a browser-based casual title with very little gameplay and actual connection to the Ultima series. And to actually get people interested in it, it would be marketed with a buxom maiden asking you to play the game. A method of marketing that would reach its peak with Evony a similar game released the year prior that had now started advertising itself as some sort of secretive, kinky game for perverts that they can play discreetly. But when it came to marketing games in strange ways, Electronic Arts still held the cup. Sure, Capcom may have misplaced some fake zombie parts around town and risk starting an infection, but EA paid people to protest its new game, Dante's Inferno, just to drum up fake outrage. It also held sinning contests, that's sinning, not singing, that promised nights of debauchery and sent money to reviewers because it was edgy and it was in theme with the circles of hell and sin motif of the game. It attempted to create something viral and for the most part failed. All it did was draw the ire of everyone involved, and thus the industry in general tried to take it down a notch, especially after that year Ubisoft botched a marketing stunt so badly for Splinter Cell Conviction that an actor almost got shot by the police in New Zealand. Sure, there would still be the odd bomb scare because of the marketing campaigns, but 2010 can be considered as peak stupid in this area. So far, we may still change things around in the coming years. Big budget titles were still the norm in 2010. Electronic Arts was trying to bring back Medal of Honor in the wake of the success that Call of Duty had, and managed to create a horrible game that would only be outmatched by its sequel. Red Dead Redemption was bringing the GTA formula to the Wild West and selling like mad. Mass Effect 2 was turning an RPG into a watered-down shooter that more people could enjoy, this time with no drama about being a space porn simulator and with progressively worse storytelling. Sony was eating a bit of humble pie after its initial release of the PlayStation 3, but was getting back there on that horse, showing off the power of the console with MAG, Massive Action Game, a title that could fit together 256 players battling in teams for supremacy on a gigantic battlefield. Had it not been shut down 4 years later, it could have served as an opportunistic approach to another trend that would come quite soon. Meanwhile, Darksiders was giving Zelda fans something they could admit to liking to their high school friends. Alan Wake was finally being released after many years of being the poster child of the power of DirectX 10, though it was still using DirectX 9 when it was actually released. Heavy Rain made interactive movies interesting again, and Obsidian was given a less than 2 years to make a sequel to Fallout 3, and somehow managed to pull it off with New Vegas. Then, because a thing called Metacritic that counts review scores and adds them up in dumb ways exists, and it showed a total score of 79, Obsidian got shafted out of millions of dollars in bonuses by Bethesda. The studio also had troubles because of its other project, Alpha Protocol, an espionage RPG with some really good ideas, a few horrible ones, and a lot of problems that were never ever fixed. 2010 was also when World of Warcraft entered a new phase of life, by destroying the old world and bringing in a new one. Cataclysm swept away what people were used to for the past 6 years and brought in a new landscape, a new experience, and managed to alienate 5 million people in the process. Even so, it was still the most popular subscription MMO. It still is. So popular that MMOs were now starting to go free to play and adding microtransactions just to keep relevant. That's something that Dungeons & Dragons Online had done the previous year, and now, months later, it had over 1 million players and was considered a massive success. It showed the world that there was an alternative, a way to compete with World of Warcraft. Naturally, this idea was known for many years in the Asian market, that's why we had all those free MMOs, but this was news to the Westerners, especially since this wasn't a cheap MMO, and yet some still tried to compete with World of Warcraft on its own terms, like Star Trek Warcraft Online, which leveraged the popularity of its brand. It wouldn't have much success either until it went free to play. And to this day, this is how most MMOs still manage to operate in the face of World of Warcraft. Even once best-selling multiplayer games, not MMOs, were going this route, like Quake 3, as it was being reimagined as an online-only shooter running through a browser in the form of Quake Live. That idea of running a game through a browser wasn't really new. I mean, we had Flash games before, there was GameTap that tried something similar before, but the trend was growing, and that's when OnLive went online, a service that would allow people to play games by streaming a video feed of it running off a dedicated server. You no longer needed a powerful PC to play games, or a PC at all. This could have probably been the post-PC age right there, but internet connections around the world weren't robust enough for it at the time. They still aren't, but we're getting there. To cloud gaming, to cloud everything. The cloud was becoming a big thing these days. You would see ads for it, for how everything will move to the cloud, how the cloud will pose some serious security concerns quite soon. The dwindling middle market was still trying its best on PC at least. In the console space, it was still go big or go home for established studios. The creators of the Penumbra series managed to give us a new horror game in the form of Amnesia: The Dark Descent, a well-paced game with some really creative frights in it. Mount & Blade Warband was released as one of the greatest mounted combat games ever made, proving continuously that Bethesda was still full of crap when it said it couldn't do mounted combat in Oblivion because it was too hard. The creator of Monkey Island, Ron Gilbert, brought us Death Spank, a parody of the hack-and-slash RPG that mixed good action with a lot of self-aware humor and a masterful half-a-cow. Though I think the half-a-cow was in the second game, it was a full cow in the first one. And sure, there were some disasters, like the troubled elemental war of magic that promised the world and delivered more than the engine could actually handle, leading to, well, a disaster. Though in its defense, it did have a budget equal to the intro video of the recent Civilization V, a game that simplified maybe a few too many things and yet improved others by adding hexes that could only be occupied by one unit. Finally, a Civilization game without the unit spam. But what was really setting the world on fire was the indie scene, the ever-growing, ever-expanding, exploding scene, if you will. Limbo came out, a platformer that managed to leverage its outstanding visual style for great success. Vavoom was a quirky, non-platformer that managed to be one and also be successful. There were a lot of platformers actually in this genre. They were the easiest to make, the ones that you could put the most effort into creating something unique, at least visually, thematically. And then Super Meat Boy came along, a platformer that prided itself on being difficult, annoying even, but inventive enough to make people interested, and it fed into the growing anti-casual counterculture trend to great success. For you see, we were at the point where people were nostalgic for the good old days, for the 80s. So very, very nostalgic, even though they had no idea what was happening in the 80s or why. But the thing that was really blowing up was Minecraft. It sold 4,000 units in total in February. By December of that year, it would have sold 670,000. In another year, it would be 4 million. And many, many more millions would have played it, what with all the piracy. The game of 2010 is without a doubt Fallout New Vegas. I say this because it represents two very important things. It was the old age of video games trying to fit into the new one. A game that took the shape it had to and still sell in this age, but tried to do it with the sensibilities of older games, with its writing style, with its pacing, with its design. It made do with what it could, and what it had wasn't much, because Bethesda gave the studio very little to work with. Just 18 months to create a massive game with no time for testing, no care put into making a functional game. It didn't matter to the publisher that the developer needed more time to finish it without working themselves to the bone. What mattered was that Bethesda had a game out quickly to capitalize on the success of Fallout 3, speed and profit, and then doing its best to shrink away from giving developers their due. To hell with making a functional game, to hell with making a game in a healthy way. way. It was about churning out a sequel as fast as possible. And yet, against all odds, New Vegas was still a good game. It was a shining beacon in a sea of muck. That was the video games industry in the AAA sector. A giant maw grinning, waiting to chew up anyone foolish enough to put their trust into it. And that hasn't really changed. Next week, we're in for some arrows, so guard your knees. Goodbye.